My name is Jennifer Jones. I am a research associate at the University of West of Scotland, and I'm also studying around the Olympic Games. So I'm looking at activism, citizen media, and how communities mobilise against mega events such as the Olympics, the Commonwealth Games and other sort of media events. I also teach web production, new media at Birmingham City University. I did my degree in media studies and then decided to run away from Scotland and move to Leicester, and I've been in Leicester 5 years, completely random, picked it on the map, I'm going to move to Leicester, and I dabbled a bit in a bit of research, but then when I went back to Scotland for a little while, I got offered a PhD studentship to study the Olympic Games, but I didn't know anything about the Olympic Games. My background's in new media. I'm a web designer by trade. I'm interested in how people form their identity online, and I'm interested in how things like social media and citizen journalism can be used as a vehicle for telling your story. The Olympic Games, for me, was all about sport, and I had nothing to do with sport. But what was really interesting was when I started doing the Olympic stuff, I realised how large this event was, and how many people's lives it affected that you didn't actually see in the mainstream media. Because the mainstream media is essentially working for this industry and not for the people. So I went to Vancouver. I was in Canada for 6 weeks during the winter 2012 Olympic Games, and I worked with a lot of communities who are against the Olympics. Now, I went there after 6 weeks being enrolled in my research project, so I didn't really know much about the Olympics, but beyond it being a sport event, that was for people that weren't really like me, who weren't really interested in sport. So I worried that when I got there that I would know what to look for, so I had a completely free scope to search for as many different things around new media and the games, and what I came across when I was there was how activist communities, people that had resisted the Games bid that was 7 years previously, had worked up a narrative and worked up sort of solidarity against the Olympics. And I was interested in how they were using the internet to communicate that message. And since then, this was 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, nearly 2.5 years ago, I've been looking at how these pockets of new media are around other protest movements. So we have the Arab Springs in the Middle East, we have the Occupy movements, we have the student protests in the UK. I'm interested in how these tools, mobile technology, social media tools such as Twitter and Facebook, and other devices are being used to communicate messages. And the reason why I'm here at the Documentary Film Festival is because I work quite closely with Citizens Eye, because Citizens Eye is a community media organisation that is looking to empower people to be able to tell their stories. So that's the link to the documentary stuff. The Olympic movement is 120 odd years old. It was established in the 19th century in Europe. It's very Western, it's very imperialistic, so it's about dominating countries to behave in a certain way. So it's governed by an Olympic Charter, and the Olympic Charter details quite explicitly that Olympism is a way of life. Not the Olympic Games, but the notion that Olympism is a way of life, as a philosophy. The Olympic Games is a vehicle for communicating that Olympism. So we watch the games, we're inspired by athletes, we're inspired by great human beings, and we're meant to feel like those people can inspire us to do the best that we can. Problem is that the Olympic Games cost a hell of a lot of money to communicate that message, and the people that the money moves from the public pocket into the private purse, because the only way that it can actually occur is if it's sponsored by companies such as McDonald's, Coca-Cola, General Motors, Dow Chemicals, companies which aren't really saying much about being the best human being you can be. It's all about profit. Now, the problem with the Olympic Games is that to build an Olympic arena, to build all the infrastructure, to carry the many people that come to the Olympic Games, one of the most watched mega events in the world, we have to move other people out the way. So the easiest place to develop an Olympic Games is to develop it in places where land is cheap. where it's easy to move people on. So many Olympic Games are built on areas of great poverty and people are displaced from their communities. So a lot of the activist movements around the Olympic Games are local people who have been disrupted by this Olympic process. So they might have not never cared about the Olympic Games before, they might have watched it on the television, they might have been inspired, their kids might have got it at school about gold medals, but it isn't until somebody comes along and kicks you out your house and says, move over, the circus is coming to town, that people actually realise that the Olympics is something that's not to be trusted in a way that we think it's to be trusted. So yeah, there's a lot of complexities around the Olympic Games in terms of human rights issues, which the Olympic Charter states that sport is a human right, but when the Olympic goes to China and the debate around Tibet, where does the human rights issue stand in that? So there's a lot of complexity around how the Olympics want to be perceived and what actually happens underneath the surface. What's happening in the Arab Spring is very interesting. Well, in North Africa is really interesting because people are using mobile tools to document their story constantly now. They're constantly documenting what is happening and retelling the stories as it's happening. It's a wave of a new technology coming into the space. But what comes out of that technology, the artefacts, the outputs, the film, the media that they produce, once it's out in the mainstream, can be interpreted in many different ways. So within the community, people can rally around and tell the stories together amongst a community of trust. But the minute those stories get out, it becomes completely, the context disappears. It becomes a context bubble burst, and that's when you can't actually control the message of the narrative. So back to the Olympics, a lot of the activists that I spoke to, because I can't speak on behalf of people in North Africa, I've only spoken to some individuals online, I've not been there, I've not been around it, but in other activist circumstances it tends to be that communities tell their own story, their own narrative, and they learn from each other, but once those outputs start getting out and start to a wider audiences, that's when they can start being used against them. There was a film today, the Occupy London screening that Lucy Peel had been down there when London, the St Paul's was being occupied. She's right in it, she's capturing what's there right up. You become so used to seeing those images in mainstream media that you have to remember that this documentary that you're watching is somebody there in the front line. So it's very difficult to kind of separate the citizen media, the individual creating things, and the mainstream media interpreting it in their own narrative. So they've got a very short period of time to tell a very complex story, and they'll tell the easiest story that can reach out to the widest population, and that's why footage in the Arab Spring has been used to justify war, because it's the easiest narrative to explain on mainstream media. And I don't believe it's right, but it's very difficult to combat that. The three sort of main issues from the Vancouver, that it was sort of the campaigns of people, it wasn't like a uniformed campaign, like a marketing campaign, it was the three sort of key issues around the games which they were angry about. It was like homelessness, and it was about, on top of that, lack of social housing, social care, and then it was the treatment of the First Nation communities who'd not only been sort of treated like crap since Vancouver was built, but the Olympics completely wiped out what remaining communities were left, and they essentially got put onto the street as well, or asked to leave the city in a way. So what it kind of, the awareness of what it raised was everybody knew about the campaign that was called No Olympics on Stolen Native Land, and that became a chant and stickers everywhere, and that became part of the threads of discussion in the city. So you're sitting in a bus and people wearing the Canadian flags going to see a hockey game knew that there was a campaign, No Olympics in Stolen Native Land. So that, in terms of public consciousness, it became something that you couldn't wipe away. There was a memory, there was a history that you couldn't wipe away. It didn't provide budgets, it didn't provide extra facilities, there's probably more security and more homelessness, but it rose awareness to something that was happening anyway. If they didn't stand up and fight it, would be 100 times worse, 1 billion times worse. So yeah, I'm looking at Vancouver now. It's sort of a really privatised space, but I can't comment too much on that because I'm not from there. I went for 6 weeks, so I don't know what it was like before. I don't know what it's like after. I'd like to go back and speak to people, interview people that I was there with, but it's difficult. It's interesting, but also frightening what the Olympics can do to a city. But if they didn't have the Olympics, would they be going in that direction anyway? That's the ultimate. A city's got to want to have a reason to have the Olympics, so they've obviously got a plan. So it's very difficult.